They fastened the iron chain around Sable's neck so tightly that the cold metal bit into her skin. "Down," Matron Call ordered, pointing at the muddy kennel floor. "Dogs crawl. They don't walk." Sable hesitated for only a heartbeat before lowering herself onto trembling hands and knees. The chain rattled across the stones as she crawled forward. A stable boy burst into laughter. "Look, she actually obeyed." Another maid clapped her hands. "She's smarter than the hounds." The courtyard echoed with mocking voices. "Come on, little stray. Crawl faster. Maybe she understands commands better than people." Matron Call slowly circled Sable, the tip of her polished boot, stopping inches from the girl's face. "I told you years ago," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "You have no bloodline, no family, no name. You were born lower than the dogs you feed. At least they have pedigrees." The servants laughed even harder. Call grabbed the chain and jerked it violently, forcing Sable's head upward. "If you're going to live in my kennels," she sneered, "then behave like one." She pointed toward the nobles, watching from the balcony. "Now bark." "Silence." "I said bark." Sable slowly closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek before a broken sound escaped her throat. "Woof!" The laughter exploded. Again, louder. "That's the funniest thing I've seen all year." One servant threw a piece of stale bread into the mud. "Fetch it." Another tossed a bone at her feet. "Maybe she'll wag her tail too." Sable lowered her head, refusing to let them see the humiliation burning inside her. Every bark felt like another piece of her soul being stripped away. Every laugh reminded her of the lie she had heard since childhood, that she had been born without blood, without a family, without even the right to be called human. None of them realized that the throne of Greymark Hall had miraculously lit up, finding the bloodline it had awaited for centuries. The girl they had forced to crawl like a dog in a cage was the sole surviving descendant of the founders of Greymark. And soon all her mockers would kneel at her feet. But on that cold morning, neither Sable nor her tormentors knew that destiny had called her by her true name. In 300 readings, the blind oracle Vesper had never once spoken a word the moon did not give her. So when she stopped the Alpha King's own prophecy halfway through, turned her clouded eyes toward the lowest row of the hall and spoke the name of a kennel girl, the whole kingdom swore had no bloodline at all. Every noble in Greymark Hall forgot how to breathe. The name she spoke was Sable. Beneath the great silver moon window, where the cold light fell in a single pale circle on the reading court floor, Sable stood frozen with dried hound blood crusted on her sleeves and a cracked feeding pail still gripped in both hands. She had not come to be seen. She had come only to carry the old warhound that had fouled the corridor the way she carried everything in that place quietly, with her eyes down, hoping to finish before anyone noticed she existed. Behind her, close to her ear, Matron Call's voice came low and fast and frightened in a way Sable had never once heard it. "Do not answer her," the matron whispered. "Keep your head down. Girls like you do not have names. You were born of no line. Say nothing, and this passes." But the oracle's blind face stayed turned toward her, and the whole court had turned with it. 300 lords and ladies, and the Alpha, King himself on his high seat, all of them staring at the smudged girl in the moonlight, as though she had walked into the hall wearing a crown she had stolen. Sable did not understand what was happening. She knew only that her heart had gone very loud, that the cracked pail trembled in her hands, and that the matron who had told her every single day of her life that she was no one had just gone the color of ash. She did not yet know that the name Vesper had spoken was not a gift, but a key, and that some doors, once a true name turns in their lock, can never be shut again. She did not know that the kingdom had not merely overlooked her. It had buried her carefully on purpose without a grave. And she did not know that the king, watching her from his high seat, had felt something turn over in his chest the moment he saw the frayed black cord knotted around her wrist, the only thing in the world that had ever been hers. Long before the moon window ever found her, Sable's days began in the dark on the straw. She woke each morning before the first gray touched the sky in the corner of the royal kennels where the oldest warhounds slept, because Matron Call had decided when Sable was still a small child that a nameless girl did not deserve a bed. The hounds did not mind her. They were old scarred beasts. The kingdom had stopped feeding well, and they had learned across the years that the thin girl who curled among them at night brought warmth and took none of their meat, and so they made room. She had grown up with her cheek against a hound's flank and the smell of straw and dog in her hair, and she had stopped somewhere along the way, finding it strange. She earned no coin. She had never in her life held a coin that was her own. For her work, and she worked from the dark of the morning to the dark of the night, hauling water, mucking the runs, binding the torn ears and split pads of dogs, the kennel master could not be troubled with. She was given crusts and the broth left in the pot, after the hounds were fed, and permission to remain. That was the wage Matron Call named it permission. The right to keep breathing in a place that had no use for her beyond her two hands. You were born of no line, the matron told her, as she had told her 1,000 times, the words worn smooth as river stones from the saying. No mother ever claimed you. No father ever named you. The kennels took you out of charity when nothing else in the world would have you. Be grateful, girl, and be quiet, and never imagine you are owed a single thing more. Sable had believed it for as long as she could remember, the way a child believes the shape of the only room she has ever been allowed to stand in. She owned nothing. Not a bed, not a name worth speaking, not a single soul who would notice if she did not wake one morning among the hounds, except for the cord. Around her wrist, she wore a frayed length of black braid, soft and greasy with age, knotted and re-knotted 100 times as it wore thin. It was the only thing that had been found with her when she was left at the kennel gate as an infant, and across the years, she had guarded it more carefully than her own skin. When Matron Call was cruel, Sable would press her thumb to the knot of it in the dark and tell herself that someone once in some life she could not remember had tied that cord around the wrist of a child they did not want to lose. It was a small thing to build a heart on. It was all she had. And there were the words. She did not know where they came from. At night, asleep among the hounds, Sable hummed long, low strings of sound in a tongue she had never been taught and could not have written down phrases that rose out of her dreams and spilled from her sleeping mouth like water finding an old channel in the rock. The other kennel girls had heard her at it for years. They called it dog singing, and they laughed, and they told the new girls that the straw girl howled in her sleep like the beasts she lived with. Sable would wake to their laughter and not remember a note of it, only the strange ache it left behind, the sense of having spoken a language to someone in the dark and woken before they could answer. She did not know that the words were real. She did not know they were old, older than Greymark Hall, older than the throne, a tongue that the kingdom had spent a great deal of effort to bury, along with the blood it belonged to. But once, on the worst night of a hard winter, the old blood in her had done more than sing. The storm had come down off the mountains for 3 days without breaking, and the cold had pressed into the kennels until even the hounds whimpered. Sable had gone out past the runs to drag in the last of the firewood when she found it by the outer wall, a great black wolf, far too large for any natural beast, its hind leg caught and torn on a fallen length of iron fencing, its breath coming in red clouds, its eyes fixed on her with something that was not the dull animal fear she knew from snared things. It watched her the way a person watches. She should have run. A wolf that size could have opened her throat with one turn of its head. Instead, Sable knelt in the driving snow and spoke to it low, the way she spoke to a frightened hound. And when it did not lunge, she took the only cloak she owned from her own shoulders and tore it into strips and bound the ragged wound as gently as her numb fingers could manage. The wolf shuddered under her hands and did not bite. "There," she had whispered to it, blinking the snow from her lashes. "No one deserves to die out here unnamed, not even you." By the gray of the next morning, the wolf was gone, and the strips of her cloak with it, and only the dark stain of its blood in the trampled snow remained to tell her she had not dreamed the whole thing. She had gone back to the straw and the crusts and the matron's worn cruelty, and she had never told a living soul, because who would believe the dog-singing straw girl had nursed a wolf the size of a pony through a killing storm? She never knew that the wolf had been no wolf at all. She never knew that the Alpha King Rahan had been bound into that cursed shape for the length of a secret bloodline trial alone, and dying by the outer wall of his own kingdom, and that the last face he had seen before the fever took him had been the face of a kennel girl who tore her only warmth into bandages for a stranger and asked him nothing in return. What Sable did notice in the days after was the matron. For Matron Call had come upon her one evening as she hummed over a sick hound, half lost in the old words without knowing it. And the matron had stopped in the doorway as though she had walked into a wall. The blood had drained out of her hard face. She had stood there, listening to the straw girl sing in a dead tongue, and her hands had begun to shake. And she had said in a voice Sable had never heard her use, "Where did you learn that? Who taught you those words?" And when Sable, bewildered, said no one had taught her anything, that she did not even know what she had been singing. The matron had gone away, white and silent, and had been sharp and watchful with her ever since. Sable had thought in her innocence that she had done something wrong. She did not understand that Matron Call had just heard a ghost, that those words were never meant to be sung again by any living mouth, because every mouth that had ever known them was supposed to have died long ago, with the founder line of Greymark. The matron knew exactly what she had heard, and she knew with a cold certainty that kept her awake that night, and many after that. The lie she had spent her whole life guarding had been quietly growing teeth in her own kennels all along. Back in the reading court, under the cold circle of the moon window, the silence the oracle had made was beginning to break, and it broke badly. "Bring her forward," Lord Maylor said, before the king could speak. He was a heavy, careful man, with a voice built for filling halls, and he filled this one now with exactly the right note of weary patience. "Let us all look at the girl the moon has supposedly chosen." The guards took Sable by the arms and drew her out of the shadow of the kennel rows into the center of the floor, and the hall got its first clear look at her. Someone laughed. Then more of them, the easy laughter of people relieved to be told that the impossible thing they had just witnessed was only a mistake after all. "Look at her sleeves," a lady said, not troubling to lower her voice. "Look at the pail. The kennel reeks on her from across the room. This is the air of someone's prophecy." Sable stood in the middle of all of it and held very still, the way she held still under the matron's hand, and stared at the polished floor, because the floor at least did not laugh. "Enough." The Alpha King had risen. Rayan did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that a king who shouts has already lost the room, and so the single word came quiet and flat and stopped the laughter, as if a door had been shut on it. He came down from the high seat, slowly, his eyes on the girl, and something in his face was wrong in a way the court could not read. Because Rayan had seen the black cord on her wrist. He did not know why it shook him. He only knew that the sight of that frayed braid against the girl's thin wrist had reached into his chest and turned something over, the way a smell or a few notes of a song will open a door in a man he did not know was there. He had the sudden senseless certainty that he had seen those hands before. Small, chapped, careful hands, though he could not, for his life, have said where. "You stopped my reading," he said to the oracle, without taking his eyes from Sable. "In 300 readings, you have never once been wrong and never once interrupted yourself. Tell me plainly, Vesper, did you mean to speak this girl's name, or did the moon slip its leash?" Oracle, Vesper turned her blind face toward him, and her voice, when it came, filled the hall more completely than Maelor's had, though it was hardly above a whisper. "In 300 readings," she said, "I have never spoken one word the moon did not command of me. You have built your throne on that, my king. You have hanged men and spared men on my readings, and never once found me false. So hear me now, and weigh it the same. The moon did not slip. The moon commands her. That girl, in her hound blood and her rags, is the reading I was born to give, and every reading before her was only the moon clearing its throat." It was the worst thing she could have said for the peace of the hall, and the truest, and she knew it. To call Sable false was to call Vesper false, and to call Vesper false was to pull the floor out from under 30 years of the kingdom's judgments. The court felt the trap close around them and did not like it at all. With respect to the oracle's long service, Lord Maelor said smoothly, into the dangerous quiet, "Even a faultless instrument may at last crack. 300 readings is a great age for any gift. Perhaps it is not falsehood we are seeing, but the first mercy of an old woman's failing. Let us not overturn the order of the whole realm on the strength of one strange evening. Let the girl be taken back to the kennels and kept, and the matter examined quietly by those of us with the wisdom to examine it. By those of us Sable understood dimly meant by him. And kept quietly, she understood with the instinct of the powerless meant something she did not want to be the subject of. Behind the lords near the doors, Matron Call had gone very still and was watching Maelor with the held breath of a fellow conspirator, praying the other will not fumble the lie. "No," said the king. Said he had reached Sable by now. Up close, she was smaller than she had looked from the dais, and she would not lift her eyes, and there was a fresh bruise yellowing along her jaw that someone had given her not many days past. Rayan looked at the bruise and at the cord and at the cracked pail still clutched in her white-knuckled hands, as though it were the last solid thing in a world that had tilted, and he made a decision that he could not yet have explained to himself. "She will not go back to the kennels," he said loud enough for the hall. "If my oracle, whose word has been law in this court for 30 years, names this girl before the throne, then this girl is under the protection of the throne until I am satisfied I understand why. She will be housed and fed and untouched." His gaze moved deliberately across Maelor and across the matron in the shadows by the door, and let them both feel it land. "Untouched by anyone. The first hand laid on her without my leave answers to me for it. And if it is a mistake," Maelor pressed the smoothness wearing thin, "if the old woman has erred, and you have raised a kennel drudge to the protection of the crown before the whole court, how will the king unsay it? Then I will have wasted some bread and a bed on a girl who has plainly been given little enough of either," Ratian said. "I will survive the cost. Can you say what it will cost us to be wrong the other way?" Maelor had no answer for that. He could give aloud, and he was clever enough to stop. So, Sable, who had come into the reading court to carry out a fouling hound and leave before anyone noticed her, walked out of it on the far side at the side of the Alpha King, with the whole court's eyes on her back and not one friendly face among them. In the days that followed, she learned that the king's protection was a strange and frightening gift. She was given a real room, with a door that latched from the inside, the first she had ever had, and she did not sleep the first 3 nights, for fear of it lying awake on the unfamiliar softness, listening for the matron's step. She was given clothes without hound blood on them, and she was given more than anything, the king's questions, because Ryan had set himself to understand the thing that had turned over in his chest, and he was not a man who let a question alone. They began in the sealed ledger chamber. It was a cold stone room off the oldest part of the hall, where the kingdom kept the records. It did not trust to the open archives, the bloodline rolls, the sealed judgments, the histories that touched the throne too closely to leave where any hand could reach them. Rayan had the authority to open it. Few others did. He brought Sable there because the rolls of every noble line in Greymark were kept in it, and he meant to find hers or prove she had none and be done with the matter. They found neither, and that was the first thread to come loose. For where the founder line of Greymark should have been recorded, the first blood, the line from which every later king's claim descended, there was a gap. Not an empty page, a removed one. The binding showed the ghost of pages cut away with a careful blade long ago, and the record simply resumed on the far side of the wound, as though nothing had ever been there. Rayan ran his thumb along the cut edge and felt the cold come up out of the stone into him. Someone took the founding from the founding roll, he said slowly, in the most guarded book in my kingdom, and dressed the cut to be missed. Sable, who could read a little, leaned over the gap, and without thinking, she pressed her thumb to the knot of the cord at her wrist and hummed 3 soft notes of the dead tongue, the way she did when she was frightened and did not know it. And in the cold, sealed chamber, the sound of those notes against the cut pages made the king go absolutely still. "Say that again," he said. "Say what, my king?" I said nothing. "The sound you made. You did it in the hall, too, the first night, under your breath." He was looking at her now the way he had looked at the cord, as though a door long shut in him were swinging. "Where did you learn it?" "I didn't." Her voice was small. "It comes out of me in the dark. The other girls call it dog singing. I'm sorry, I'll stop." "Don't stop," Rayan said. "That is the second time tonight. A thing that should not exist has spoken in this room." Neither of them noticed then how close they had drawn over the cut pages, nor how long the king held the gaze of a girl who had spent her whole life forbidden to lift her eyes. Sable noticed it after lying awake in her latched room, the warmth of standing near someone who looked at her as if she were a question worth answering, instead of a draft in the corridor, and how dangerous a warmth that was for a girl with nothing, and how she could not make herself stop wanting it. And Lord Mailer noticed something too. He noticed that the king had taken the kennel girl into the sealed ledger chamber, the one room in Greymark that held the one secret his whole fortune rested upon. And that very night, he sent a quiet word to Matron Call, 2 lines in a careful hand that said only the king has begun to read. We do not have long. The answer was not in the sealed ledger, because someone had cut it out of the sealed ledger. So Rayan went to the one record in his kingdom that could not be cut. He went to Vesper. The oracle received them beneath the moon window, after the court had emptied for the night, when the silver light lay clean and cold across the reading floor, and there was no one to laugh or to carry tales. She had Sable kneel in the circle of moonlight, not as a punishment, the old woman said, but because the moon needed to see her plainly. Then Vesper laid her dry fingers against the frayed black cord at the girl's wrist, and she went very quiet, and for a long while The only sound in the hall was Sable's frightened breathing. "Shing," Vesper said at last. "The song you do not remember. Do not reach for it. Let it come." Sable did not know how to summon the thing that only ever rose in her sleep. But the moonlight was strange on her skin, and the old woman's fingers were warm on the cord, and the cut pages were still cold in her memory, and somewhere under all of it, the long-buried blood in her stirred and answered. The dead tongue came up out of her low and aching, and this time she was awake to hear it. And as she sang the cord at her wrist, that greasy, worn braid she had guarded her whole life began very faintly to glow. Vesper let out a breath that was almost a sob. "There," the oracle whispered. "There you are, after all these years. They told the whole kingdom you were ash on the wind, and here you kneel, singing the founding song in the founder's own moonlight." She lifted her blind face to the king. "This is no kennel drudge given a lucky name, Ryan. This is the blood your throne was raised to serve and then to bury. The first line of Greymark, the founder line, was never carried off by plague or war, whatever the histories you were given say. It was murdered, and the last of it hidden where no one would think to look for a queen in the straw, among the hounds, raised on the lie that she was no one, so that no one would ever come looking. The song proves it. The chord proves it. The moon has only said aloud what was done in the dark." Sable knelt in the light and shook. "I don't understand. I carry pails. I sleep with the dogs. I can't be—" "You were made to carry pails," Vesper said gently, "precisely so that you could not be. That was the whole design of it." And Rayan, listening, felt the last of it fall into place inside him with a cold finality. The chord, the dead tongue song, the small, chapped, careful hands that had reached for him without fear. He knew now where he had seen those hands. He had been dying by the outer wall in a shape that was not his own, fevered and certain of his death, and a thin girl had knelt in the snow and torn her only cloak into strips for a wounded animal and told it that no one deserved to die unnamed. He had carried the memory of that night for years and never known the face that went with it. He knew it now. It was kneeling in the moonlight in front of him. "It was you," he said. The words came out rough. "The winter of the long storm. The wolf by the wall. That was Sable. That was me. I was bound in that shape for a trial of the blood, and I would have died there, and you gave me your only cloak and asked me nothing." He had to stop. A king does not often find himself robbed of words in front of his own oracle. "You saved my life before you ever knew I had one worth saving. And then I walked past you in my own hall for years and let them work you like a beast." It should have been the great turning, the two truths meeting in the moonlight, the lost heir and the king who owed her his life. For a moment, it nearly was. Sable looked up at him, and her guarded face cracked, and the warmth she had been afraid to want rose up in her so strong it frightened her. And then, because she was a girl who had been taught from infancy that nothing in this world is given without a price, the colder thought came. It came slowly over the following days, the way frost climbs a window. She turned the king's words over and could not put them down. He had recognized the cord the first instant he saw it. He had said himself it had reached into his chest and turned something over before the oracle named her, before any of it. So he had known, hadn't he? Or half known, from the very first moment in the hall, that the kennel girl might be more than a kennel girl. And he had said nothing. He had brought her into the sealed chamber and let her sing over the cut pages and watched her, the way a man watches a key he hopes will fit a particular lock. Because what did the king gain if she was the founder line Sable was not clever in the way of the court, but she was not a fool, and the powerless learn early to see where the advantage runs. A throne that had buried the first blood was a throne built on a theft. But a king who found the lost heir, who sheltered her, who raised her up, who stood beside her, when the truth came out, that king did not lose his throne. That king washed it clean. He made the old crime into his own act of justice. He turned 4 generations of a stolen seat into a story of the good king who gave it back with himself, standing at the center of it, forgiven. And the oracle. 30 years of perfect readings, and her whole authority resting on never being wrong. Of course, Vesper would want the girl to be the heir. Vesper had staked her own legend on it the moment she spoke the name. Neither of them could afford for Sable to be no one now. So when Rayan came to her warm and unguarded, in a way she had never seen a powerful man be, and spoke of the wolf in the snow and the debt he owed her, Sable heard underneath it something else. She heard a man assembling his case. She heard the wolf in the snow story for what it could be made to do, proof that the king had loved the heir before he knew her, worth the perfect, unanswerable defense against anyone who might say he sheltered her for the throne's sake. Was any of it true? She asked him on the night it finally broke out of her. They were in the ledger chamber again, the cut pages between them. The wolf, the cloak. Or did your oracle tell you the story to use the way she told you my name? Rayan looked as though she had struck him. You think I invented dying by my own wall? I think, Sable said, and her voice shook with the effort of saying a true thing to a king, that everyone in this hall has a reason to want me to be the heir. You to make your throne honest, her to make her readings true. And I have spent my whole life being told what I am by people who needed me to be it. Matron Call needed me to be no one, so I was no one. Now you need me to be the founder line, and a song comes out of me, and a chord glows, and how am I to know which lie is mine? She pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth. You knew the chord the first moment. You said so yourself. You watched me before you ever told me what you suspected. That is not the act of a man who loves a girl. That is the act of a man who has found something useful and is waiting to be sure of it. I did not tell you what I suspected, Rayan said low, because I did not believe it myself. Because the thing I suspected was that a girl I had grieved for years without a face had been sleeping in my own kennels the whole time, and I did not dare hope it was true. I was not measuring you, Sable. I was afraid to be wrong. He spread his hands helpless, in a way kings are not built to be. But I see I cannot prove that to you. I can only tell you what I am and ask you to weigh it. And I see that, to a girl who has been lied to since the cradle, the word of one more powerful person is the cheapest coin in the world. It was honest, and it was true, and it landed exactly wrong, because the wound in her was older than he was, and a heart taught from infancy to expect betrayal will read the truth itself as one more clever lie. Sable turned away from him over the cut pages, and the warm thing that had nearly bloomed in the moonlight closed up tight again, and both of them felt it close. And in the cold corner of the kennels, Matron Call read Lord Maylor's 2 careful lines by candle, and understood that the time for whispers was over. The girl had sung in the moonlight. The chord had glowed. The king had begun to read the very pages that should have stayed cut forever. If the founder line woke fully and the truth was spoken aloud before the court, every soul who had built a life on the lie, the matron Maylor, the long line of kings whose claim rested on a murder, would lose everything in a single night. There was only one thing left that could still silence a founder heir for good, and Matron Call knew exactly what it was. Every false claimant who had ever reached for the throne of Greymark had been made to face the Iron Crown, and the Iron Crown burned the false to ash. All they had to do, the matron thought, blowing out the candle, was put the kennel girl's head beneath it, before the king could stop them, and let the crown do what fire had failed to do 18 years ago in the ashes, where they had left her. They came for her at the grey hour, the way such things are always done when the king was occupied and the hall was thin of witnesses. Lord Maelor had chosen his ground with care. He could not simply have Sable killed. A murdered girl whom the oracle had named would only prove the oracle right and make a martyr of the kennels. He needed her unmade in the open by a law no one could argue with, and Greymark had exactly such a law. For 7 generations, every soul who reached for the throne without the blood to hold it had been made to face the Iron Crown in its sanctuary, and for 7 generations, the Iron Crown had burned the false to ash and left the true untouched. It had not cooled for anyone in living memory, because no true blood had come before it in living memory. Maelor was counting on that. Put the kennel girl's head beneath the crown that burns pretenders, and let the kingdom watch a fraud reduced to cinders, and the matter of the founder line would be closed forever in a way no cut page ever could. He had the law on his side, or the shape of it. He stood before the thin morning court and named Sable, a false claimant, raised up by a failing oracle and a soft-hearted king, and he demanded, as was any noble's right, under the old custom, that the claim be tested by the crown. Once the word was spoken aloud before witnesses, even the king could not simply refuse it without seeming to fear the answer. So Sable was taken down to the Iron Crown's sanctuary, a low round chamber of black stone, where the crown hung on its iron hook above a scorched dais, and she understood, looking at the soot-stained stone beneath it, exactly what they meant to happen to her. Matron Call stood among the watchers with her hard face arranged into grief and would not meet her eyes. This was the lowest place Sable had ever stood, lower than the straw, lower than the worst of the matron's cruelty. Because in the straw she had at least had her one small comfort, the belief that the cord meant someone once had loved her. Now even that had been turned into evidence in other people's schemes. The oracle wanted her to be the heir. The king wanted her to be the heir. Maelor wanted her to be a fraud and burn. Every powerful person in Greymark needed her to be some particular thing, and not one of them, she thought, standing under the crown that would kill her, had ever simply wanted her to be alive. She had saved a dying wolf in the snow and asked it nothing. No one had ever once done the same for her. The crown warden hesitated, and Maelor turned the screw the only way he knew. He reminded the old man before the witnesses that the custom was the custom, that a warden who refused a lawful trial forfeited his post and his honor, both that the crown itself was the only judge here, and no one in the room had the right to stay its hand. The warden's fingers shook on the iron hook. Sable watched him reach up toward the crown and found that she had stopped being afraid in the way a person stops feeling a cold that has gone all the way to the bone. There was a strange quiet in her. She thought with a clarity that surprised her of the wolf in the snow, and of how it had looked at her as though it knew her, and how that one moment of being truly seen by a dying animal had been worth more than 18 years of the matron's roof. If she was about to burn, she decided she would not give Maelor the gift of her terror. She would think of the snow and the great dark eyes, and the only kindness she had ever been allowed to give freely, and she would go out of the world the way she had wanted to live in it, unbowed and unafraid, and refusing to the last to believe she was no one. "Put it on her," Maelor said. And then the door of the sanctuary slammed back against the stone, and the Alpha King came through it. He had been kept away, as Maelor intended, given a border dispatch that demanded him walked in the wrong direction by men in Maelor's pay. He had understood the trick too late and come back at a dead run, and he arrived in the sanctuary, out of breath, and past the end of his patience, and for the first time in his reign, Ryan did not care in the least how a king was supposed to look. "Take your hands off her," he said. "The custom is invoked, your majesty," Mylor answered, smooth even now. "Before witnesses. A claim to the founder blood tested by the crown. You taught this court yourself that the law stands above the king's own wishes. Will you break your own law to shield a girl you fear cannot survive it? What does that tell us about how much you truly believe the oracle's word?" It was a clever box, and Rayan saw all its walls at once. If he refused the trial, he confessed he thought Sable false and doomed her another way. If he allowed it, and the crown was what 7 generations swore it was, he would watch the girl who had saved his life burn in front of him. He looked at Sable. She was not weeping. She was standing under the crown with her chin up and her eyes somewhere far away, the way she had stood under every blow of her life, waiting for it to be over, and the sight of it broke something in him that had been cracking since the night in the moonlight. "You want to know what I believe," he said, and he turned to the watchers, to the whole thin, frightened court of them. "Then I will tell you, and stake myself on it, so none of you can pretend I hid behind the law. I believe she is the founder line. I believe my own throne has sat on a murder for 7 generations, and that this girl is the proof of it, that someone has been trying to burn since she was an infant in the ashes. And I believe the Iron Crown will not harm her, because the crown does not burn the true blood, and she is the truest blood in this kingdom." He drew his sword and drove it point down into the scorched dais and left it standing there, his own, before them all. "If I am wrong, I have staked my honor and my word and my throne on a kennel girl and lost them, and you may have the lot. But I am not going to stand in the shadows and let you tell me the law forbids me to defend her. Put the crown on her if the custom demands it. But I will be standing beside her when you do, and my blood is in this line too, and we will see what the crown makes of a king who finally tells the truth." A murmur went through the watchers, uncertain now the certainty Maelor had built beginning to crack. Sable looked at the king standing with his sword in the dais and his throne on the table, and the cold thought she had carried for days, that he only wanted her useful, could not survive the sight of it. A man does not gamble his crown on a thing he means to exploit. A man gambles his crown on a thing he loves. "Do it," Sable said quietly, before her courage could fail. "Put it on me." She looked at Rayan. "If it burns me, then they were right, and at least it will be over. And at least one person in this hall stood beside me at the end. And if it doesn't—" She did not finish. She turned to the Iron Crown, and she pressed her thumb one last time to the worn black cord at her wrist, and she lifted her own head to receive it. Elder Sorn, the old crown warden who had kept the sanctuary all his life and never once seen the crown spare a claimant, took the Iron Crown down from its hook with shaking hands and lowered it onto the brow of the kennel girl. The black iron touched her skin and went cold. It did not burn. The watchers who had come to see a fraud reduced to ash saw instead the soot-dark metal, pale in frost, form along its ancient rim, saw the scorch heat that had killed pretenders. For 7 generations, drain out of it the instant it met her blood. And then the crown did the thing. The warden had no record of it ever doing the thing it had been made to do at the very first, and never once needed to do since, because the blood it was made for had been buried 18 years deep in the straw. It bowed. The iron settled onto her brow, as if it had at last come home, and a low ringing rose out of it, and the founding song that lived in Sable's sleeping blood, woke fully and poured up through the metal until the whole sanctuary rang with the dead tongue of the founder line, sung now by the crown itself in answer to the heir it had waited 7 generations to crown. There was nothing left to argue. A cut page could be called a forgery. An oracle could be called a failing old woman. A glowing cord could be called a kennel girl's trick. But the iron crown of Greymark had refused to burn her in front of the whole court, and had bowed, and no man in that sanctuary could uns. The iron crown was cold a long time before anyone in the sanctuary found the nerve to move. It was Elder Sorn who broke the silence, the old warden who had spent his whole life serving a crown he had only ever seen kill, and who now stood before a crown that had bowed. He went down stiffly onto one knee on the scorched stone, the first of all of them, and bent his white head, and said in the cracked voice of a man whose entire understanding of the world had been remade in a single morning, "It has not done that in 7 generations. It does not do it for the worthy my lady. It does it only for the blood it was forged to serve. Forgive an old fool for every year I let you sleep in the straw, not 3 doors from where it hung." And one by one, the watchers who had come to see her burn knelt instead. Not because the king commanded it, Rain had not said a word, but because there is a thing the human heart does when it has been shown beyond any further argument that it was wrong, and the cruelest among them had no more defense against the cold crown than the kindest. Sable did not know how to be knelt to. She had spent 18 years being told to keep her eyes down, and now a hall of her betters had put their eyes lower than hers, and the strangeness of it brought her closer to weeping than all the cruelty ever had. She reached up and lifted the cold crown from her own brow with both hands, carefully, the way she had lifted everything in her life that did not belong to her, and she held it and looked at it, and then she looked at the matron and the lord being held by the guards. She did not order them killed. She found somewhat to her own surprise that she had no taste for it. "You told me every day of my life that I was born of no line," she said to Matron Call. And her voice did not shake now, because the thing that had always made it shake, the fear of being struck for speaking, had finally, fully left her. That no mother claimed me, no father named me, and I should be grateful the kennels did. And the whole time you knew. You knew my mother's mother sat the first throne of this kingdom. You raised me in the straw, not because no one wanted me, but because someone was terrified of what I was. You did not save a nameless child out of charity matron. You buried a queen out of fear and called it kindness, and you made me thank you for it. She set the crown down. I am not going to do to you what you did to me. I am not going to take your name and your place and leave you in the dark to rot. But you will spend the rest of your life knowing that the girl you tried to bury sang her own way out of the ground. That is a worse sentence than I could invent, and it is the true one. They took Maelor and the matron away to the law they had bent so long, and Greymark let them go out of its sight quickly, the way a body is glad to be rid of a thorn once it is finely drawn. It was harder to mend the thing between herself and Rain, because that wound had not been put there by Call or Maelor. It had been put there long before either of them, in the cradle, by every hand that had taught a child to expect a price behind every kindness. But Ryan did not rush her. He had staked his throne on her in front of the whole court and could have asked anything in return, and he asked nothing, which was in the end the only thing that could have reached her. He came to her one evening in the ledger chamber where so much had broken, and he did not speak of the throne or the founder line or even the crown. I have thought about what you said, he told her. that everyone in this hall needed you to be something, and that not one of us ever simply wanted you alive. You were right. It was true of nearly everyone. He was quiet a moment. But there was a night years ago by the outer wall when a girl who did not know I was anything at all knelt in the snow and gave a dying animal her only cloak and asked it for nothing. That girl did not need me to be a king. She did not need me to be anything. She only thought no one should die unnamed. He looked at her. I have wanted every day since I understood it was you, to be to you what you were to that wolf, to want you alive and ask you for nothing. I do not know how to prove it except by doing it for as long as you will let me. So let me. Not the heir, not the founder line. You, nah. Sable looked at the man who had put his sword in the dais for her, and she found at last that the cold thought had nowhere left to stand. She did not fall into his arms. She was not a girl built for falling. But she crossed the cold chamber and stood close to him, closer than she had ever let herself stand to anyone who was not a hound in the dark, and she let his warmth be a thing she was allowed to want. It was a beginning. With the two of them, it was always going to be a beginning rather than a sweeping thing, and that suited them both. That night, for the first time, Rayan did a thing no king of Greymark had ever been recorded doing. He went down to the kennels himself in plain clothes and found Sable where her guards swore she would not be, and where he had known she would curled in the straw against the flank of the oldest warhound, the one with the gray muzzle and the torn ear, because the latched room with its soft bed still kept her awake, and the smell of dog and straw was the only lullaby her body had ever trusted. He did not order her up. He sat down in the straw beside her, a king in the muck of his own kennels, and the old hound opened one eye, judged him, and went back to sleep. They stayed there a long while without speaking. Sable thought he would tell her it was unseemly that the founder heir could not sleep among hounds, that she must learn to be what she now was. He said none of it. He only said, after a time, that he had spent his whole reign in rooms full of people who performed their loyalty for him, and that the straw was the first place in years he had not had to watch anyone's hands. She understood him then in a way she had not before, that he too had been lonely in the middle of a hall that knelt to him, that being seen and being used were two different hungers, and that he had recognized the first in her because he had starved of it himself. When she finally let her head rest against his shoulder, she did it the way she did everything, carefully, ready to be told she had overstepped. He only shifted to make the resting easier and said nothing, and that silence was worth more to her than any vow. What grew after that grew the way the strongest things grow, slowly tested with setbacks and silences, and the patient unlearning of a lifetime's fear. Sable took up the founder line, but she would not let them empty the kennels of the old warhounds she had grown up among, and she was known ever after for a queen who could be found more often than was thought proper, asleep against the flank of some ancient hound with straw in her hair. She kept the frayed black cord on her wrist, beside any ring of state. When the court called her the returned, or the founder heir, or the girl the moon chose, she answered to none of them so readily as she answered to her own plain name, Sable, the one the kennels had meant as a brand, and she had decided to wear as her own because she had learned the hardest possible way that a name is not what you are given, but what you make of what you are given, and she had a kingdom now to prove it to. Oracle Vesper, whose 301st reading had at last broken the thing it was always meant to break, lived to crown the founder line with her own blind hands, and said it was the only reading she had ever given that the moon had let her enjoy. It might have ended there, and ended well, But the founding song had woken more than a crown. On the night Sable first slept, untroubled in a bed of her own, the dead tongue did not rise out of her dreams as it always had, because it no longer needed to. The blood had been named, the lock had turned, the door fate sealed at her birth stood open at last. And in the sealed ledger chamber where the founding had been cut from the founding roll, Elder Sorn went back by lamplight to study the wound in the book more closely than fear had ever before allowed him. He found beneath the cut that had hidden the founder line the faint ghost of an older cut, still a second wound in the oldest page